Hello, my friend. A very happy Monday, February 3rd, 2025 to you and to you as I pray that this finds you well from wherever and whenever you are tuning in. And welcome to this message on this third day of the month of love. And on the first day, we talked about it's all about love and how love is so key and how it's one, if not the most powerful force on earth. It's all about love. Yesterday, we talked about God's kind of love, the kind of love that He calls us to, that goes beyond sensual and physical love or even familial love, the agape kind of love. And we looked at God's love being infinite, God's love for us being eternal, and also God's love for us being unconditional. And so today, on day 3, we're going to talk about how that love was actually demonstrated, that infinite, eternal, unconditional love, how it was demonstrated in how God created you and me. And so the message for today is created in love. So just as a way of introduction, physical life is birthed through the most intimate act of love, intercourse. It's when two people make love. In that love, new life is created. But you see, everything is created by God and mirrors Him. And so if new birth happens in real life in the context of love and intimacy, what I want to suggest to you is that you and I were also created in love. And we're going to be looking at it today, just considering the intentionality of God in creating you and me. So, one of my favorite scriptures is found in Genesis, the one that says that God said, "Let us create man in our own image." And it continues to say that in His own image and likeness, He made them. Male and female, He made them. You see, after God had created creation and God had created creatures, He realized that something was missing. Because while creation and creatures could reflect His attributes, His qualities, He also needed another part of creation that would reflect not just His attributes, but also His essence. And so in came you and me, in came creators. Something else that's interesting to note is that God spoke creation into existence. Let there be light, let there be land, let there be the firmament. And then when God was creating creatures, He delegated the creation of creatures to creation. He spoke to the air, and the air brought forth the birds. And He spoke to the land, and the land brought forth the animals. And He spoke to the sea, and the sea brought forth the fish. But when it was time to create creators, people that would reflect His very essence and that would be created in His image, God spoke to Himself. So you can already see an intentionality there in how God created you and me. And He patterned us after His very exact image and after His very exact likeness. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that when it was time to create you and when it was time to create me, God called that same exact Zoom meeting. God called that same exact board meeting of the Holy Trinity, and they in effect said, "Let us create Evans Kamuru in our own image. Let us create," fill in the blank, put in your name. God had that same meeting with the Trinity when it was time to create you and me, because you see, God is intentional. You do realize that there is only one of you. You are the only expression of God like you. So for that to happen, there was an intentional purpose and plan on the part of God to create you. You are created in love. And so I want to suggest to you that that's a meeting that meeting that said, let us create you, put your name in our image. That's a meeting that happened not just on the day that you were actually born, because God knew you before you were born. And I want to suggest that it didn't even happen on the day you were conceived in your mother's womb, because God knew you even before that. And by the way, this is my first point here today, that you are foreknown preciously by God. You are foreknown preciously by God before you were born, before you were conceived. This is what the Bible says in Jeremiah 1:5, and this is God talking to Jeremiah and really to you. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. I actually want to suggest to you that God foreknew you preciously before the foundations of the earth, because at the very core of who you and I are, we are spirit beings. And we are an expression of God's Spirit, and God's Spirit has always existed eternally. So the essence of you existed eternally in God. God foreknew you, and God already planned for you before the foundations of the earth. You are created in love, and the first point today is that, as you can see, because you are foreknown preciously by God before the foundations of the earth. Point number 2 on created in love today, you are formed perfectly by God. Now, all you gotta do is read Psalms 139. And you can see the psalmist talking about how God wove him, how God in his mother's womb. That tells of an intentional process. So much so that the psalmist continues to say that you and I are fearfully and wonderfully made. If you fast forward in the book of Ephesians, it talks about you and I being God's masterpiece. Now, the last time I checked, any masterpiece in any category, science, art, you name it, talks of something that is not haphazard, but something that is delicately and intentionally crafted. And you and I were not just created fearfully and wonderfully, we were created uniquely. Again, when God created you, He broke the mold. That speaks of intentionality. All I'm trying to say, my friend, is that you are not only foreknown preciously by God, number one, you are also formed perfectly by God. And the last thing that I want to leave you with here in this section is that your full life was foreplanned precisely by God. Your full life, I'll say that again, was foreplanned precisely by God. I love this song by Travis Green that says, all things are working for my good, 'cause He's intentional, never failing. All things are working for my good, yeah, 'cause He's intentional, never failing. Do you realize that God is intentional about everything, your life included? Like every detail of your life has meaning, has direction. Every detail has direction. Everything about your life has purpose. Think about it. God had planned all your days before a single one of them was. That's what it says in Psalms 139 that I referenced earlier on about God creating you fearfully and wonderfully. It said that He planned and knew all the days of our lives before a single one was, before you stepped on the scene. Do you realize that God basically ordained the exact family that you would be born into? It says that in Scripture, that He's the one who puts the solitary in families. Do you realize that God planned your exact geography? You find that in the book of Acts, where it says that God ordained the times and the places where we would live. Where you are right now is not an accident. It is a part of God's plan. God is so intentional about your life that He knows even the number of hairs on your head. God is so intentional about your life that He even gives us the comparison when He says He's the one who watches over every single sparrow, and not a single sparrow falls to the ground without His knowledge. Now, you do realize that a sparrow falls in that second category I spoke about, creation. And as important as a sparrow is, Jesus reminded us that you are of more value than many sparrows. So if sparrows cannot fall without God's knowledge, how much more intentional is God about your life? You are created in love, my friend, because your full life and every detail of it was foreplanned precisely by God. So, my friends, let's land this plane. Let's bring this thing to a close. Like I said, just in the same way procreation, the highest act of love, results in the birth of physical life, you too were created in love. God was very intentional in creating you. You are foreknown preciously by God before the foundations of the earth. You are formed perfectly by God, and your full life was foreplanned precisely by God. Now, you may wonder, what is this all for? Why did God foreknow me? Why did God perfectly create me? Why did He plan every single detail of our lives? I want to just maybe tie it up in one huge bow in this conclusion by saying that you are formed by God for God. You are formed by God for God. You are created by God for God. Number one, you are created for God's pleasure. Revelations 4:11 tells us that all things were created by Him for His pleasure. Isaiah 43:21, and somebody gave me a way of remembering this. Isaiah 43:21, Isaiah 4:321. You're going backwards. Isaiah 4:321 referring to Israel, and by extension you and I as God's people. It talks about us being a people formed for Him to declare His praise. Colossians 1:16 says that all things were created in Him for Him. You see, nothing gives me more pleasure. There's nothing that I have ever done, accomplished, created, made, founded, that gives me more pleasure than my children. Because I can look at, say, a book that I'm writing, and by the way, I'm releasing a book. I'll tell you a little bit more about it, and take pride in it, but at best it reflects my attributes. I can look at maybe a piece of art I designed. This one, by the way, was designed by my son. And at best, the things we do and create and possess, they reflect our attributes, just like creation and creatures, remember? But we too we procreate creators, people who not only embody our attributes, but our essence. And for me, my pride and joy is looking at my 3 children, because just like God, I also created my image, and my children reflect my image the most. And when I look at my children and I see myself in them, whether it's in terms of physical attributes or in terms of character traits that I've passed on to them, good, bad, and ugly, when I see myself in my children, that gives me great pleasure. And when God looks at you, my friend, and He looks at me, He sees in you and in me His image, and that gives Him great pleasure. Do you realize that God delights in you? In Zephaniah, it tells us that He rejoices over us with singing, like God sings over you. I know that will rock some of the theology that tells us that God is mad at us and He hates us and we are nothing in His eyes. But even my children on their worst day, I never think of them as worse, because I don't see them in the light of what they do or their shortcomings or triumphs. I see my image in them. When God looks at you, He sees His image in you and He delights in you. By the way, we are still on this first point of the conclusion that you are formed for God's pleasure. God delights in you. Do you realize that on God's Facebook page, on His wall, is your picture? And do you realize that God carries a picture of you in His wallet? And do you realize that on God's fridge, He has your picture there magnetized and put on there for Him to see? And the cool thing is, God's Facebook page is so big. God's wallet is so big. God's fridge is so big that he not only has a picture of you, but he also has one of me and of everyone else in the world that has ever lived, that currently lives, and will ever live. Because God delights in us. We were created. We were formed for God's pleasure. Number 2, in this conclusion, saying that you are formed by God for God. You are formed for God's pleasure. Number 2, you are formed for God's purpose. Right out of the gate in Genesis 1, he told you and I, it says he blessed them and he said, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth, replenish the earth, subdue the earth, have dominion. You are created for purpose. What is that purpose, you ask? To reflect his image, not just in yourself, but in rulership over the world that he gave us dominion over. Fast forward to Ephesians. Remember that scripture I mentioned earlier that talks about you and I being God's masterpiece? It says that we are God's masterpiece, or God's handiwork, created to do the good works that God planned for us. And listen to when God planned these works: before the foundations of the earth. You are created for God's purpose, my friend. And lastly, you are created for God's presence. I don't know, I think it's Miles Monroe who used to say that, that a plant is created for soil. That's the natural environment of the plant. And you pluck the plant out of soil, it dies. A fish was created for water. That's its natural environment. You take the fish out of that natural environment, it dies. You and I were created for God's presence. That is our natural environment. And when you take us out of God's presence, our natural environment, we too die. The death may not be physical yet, but it starts spiritually and eventually leads to physical death. Matter of fact, you and I were never created to die. But when sin severed the relationship and took us out of our rightful natural environment, the presence of God, we started to die physically. But that's a death that was preceded with spiritual death, right? So, Evans, what do you mean we were created in God's presence? Could you prove that to me? Yes. You see that right from the beginning. In the Garden of Eden, God used to hang out with Adam and Eve. It records that he used to come down in the cool of the day, and they would just have tea, 4 o'clock tea, or whatever happens in the cool of the day. Maybe they would have some paradise ice cream. I don't know. God created us to be with us. And when we broke fellowship through sin, he became Emmanuel. So from Eden, he became Emmanuel, God with us, to be with us, to restore the severed relationship through the sacrifice that he paid, the demonstration of his unfailing, unconditional, eternal, infinite love for you and me. He became Emmanuel. And then fast forward even in the future, you are formed for God forever, because your future is planned by God. Remember the way we talked about from eternity past, God foreknew you and planned for you. And then even in this life, God is with us. And even God has planned that future so that we can be with him. This is what Jesus said. When the real king, not Elvis, when the real king left the building, he said, I have gone to prepare a place for you so that where I am, you can be also. You see, it's always been about being with God. God being our God and us being his people. So my friend, let's close this thing about love. I don't know if I'm going to continue talking about it tomorrow, but so far, it's all about love. It's the most powerful force. We talked about God's unconditional love, and today we talked about how you and I were created in love. Our lives, whether we are looking at our lives here on earth or from the context of eternity past, God foreknowing us, or even the context of eternity future where God is planning to be with us forever. Hopefully you will agree that our lives are a canvas, a manuscript, a soundtrack of God's goodness and love, because you and I were created in love and for love. That's it, my friend. Rest in that love today, that love that satisfies. When we try and seek validation and love elsewhere from things and achievements and people and the culture and Facebook likes and celebritym, all of that leaves us high and dry. It falls short. It never satisfies. But when we can rest in the infinite, eternal, and unconditional love for Him that is even displayed and interwoven in the very intricate details of our lives, then we are satisfied. And out of that satisfaction and out of that abundance and overflow, we can love Him. He says, you love me because I first loved you. Out of receiving His love, we can love Him. Then we can love ourselves in a healthy way. We can love our neighbors ourselves in a healthy way by seeing them as the child of God they are. We can love our lives. Jesus said He came to give us a life that is abundant. We can love our environment of the world. God created it and He looked at it and He said it was good. You and I should be able to look at a sunrise every morning and say it is good. We can love the environment of our world. We can love the experience of our world, and we can love the expression in our world, because we were created in purpose, we were created on purpose, filled with purpose, for purpose. And I discuss these concepts in my new upcoming book, Created for Love. It's a book that is going to bless you. It's a shameless plug because I didn't write this book for me. I know there are some thoughts and ideas in there that will really, really enrich your perspective and bless your life. Look out for details of that and the launch and the release coming up here in the coming days and weeks. Hey, all I'm trying to say is remain in His love, for you are created in love for love. Until next time, a happy and blessed Monday, February 3rd, 2025 to you and yours. Bye.